OLT learning and teaching grants are distinguished from other research grants that we go for in a number of ways. So one of the most interesting things we had to get our heads around was they're not about research. So we were told from the get-go not to use the R word, that we were more interested in evaluation and actually making a difference, making a change. So in terms of the way that you actually span the research or the work that you wanted to do, you had to be very much focused on what difference is it going to make. And that was a really interesting thing that we kind of had to bear in mind throughout the writing of the proposal. And actually in the writing of the proposal, what distinguished the actual kind of working the bid up was very much around the idea of knowing the priorities of the grant makers. One of the projects we got was a strategic commission project where the actual rubric of the grant and the research questions were given to us. So we were very careful to use the language and to be aware of the concerns and to actually address the priorities that we were aware that OLT were interested in. And I think that goes for any grant that you're applying for. You're pitching it towards different audiences. So the grant makers have particular priorities in mind that you have to address. And we're also very aware of how the project was going to be used. So we were aware that we may have had a particular passion that may have been specific to our own faculty or our own research group, but we were actually trying to make sure that this was work that would be useful across the sector. So one of the things I always had in mind was, how would a professor in another faculty read this? So I'm from the Faculty of Education. How would an engineering professor read this? And if he or she couldn't make sense of it, then it wasn't worth writing about. So that was really salutary. And the other thing we bore in mind as well were other users of the research. So we wanted to make sure that our research was both useful to and could be usable by students, by university leaders and administrators and managers, and also by non-HE sector users. So we also wrote it with industry users in mind as well. Mm-hmm. So just having a kind of holistic sense of what this was for and who might be using it was really, really useful. Well, it took a long time to write proposals. I always try not to underestimate how long it takes to write proposals. I hate missing deadlines or pushing it up to the wire. So we put in for 2 OLT grants. Both of them, I would say, took 3 to 4 months to write, from thinking of the initial idea to actually getting it in. So the first 4 or 5 weeks in terms of writing up a really good first draft, and then another 2 months to actually write and rewrite and rewrite. And I think both of them we had 5 or 6 different iterations and different drafts of the proposal. And then it also took another good 2 or 3 weeks to actually get everything signed off and the budget signed off and everything through the system. So at a push, 3 months, but if you can give yourself 4 months, then your life might be a bit easier. The challenges of putting these grants together in some ways don't differ from many other proposals that you're putting. There's nothing particularly challenging about OLT. In fact, in many ways, they were fairly easy to put together because the brief and the rationale for them was very, very clear. So in a way, there was a challenge of thinking about how this research could be used beyond your own interest, which is not something you normally do as a researcher, because you're normally thinking about your own immediate research literature or your immediate research interests or research questions. And these are grants that actually have to have a life beyond your own kind of interests. So there was a little bit of a challenge in terms of making sure that you were doing something that would just move beyond your own specialist area. We wanted to put together bids with partner institutions, and obviously that's really good because you get the whole interdisciplinary and the interinstitutional expertise, but there are obviously challenges with working with different partners, making sure that you're all kind of happy with the way that you're going and even just meeting up. But in the end, that actually turned out to be a bonus. And one of the things we did find was OLT were very useful to work with as well. So when we actually got the grants, and there were particular issues with partners wanting to change the way that they were working, we found it really easy to actually kind of approach OLT with some reasonable suggestions for changing the project. And we found that throughout the lifetime of the project, we were able to kind of let it evolve in terms of the way that the partners wanted to work. So there were challenges, but actually, to be fair, I think it was a fairly easy awarding body to work with, particularly compared to other research funders. What helped us write a good proposal? Without wishing to kind of be too Monash-centric, we did get a huge amount of help from the Monash Academy team. There was a lot of support in terms of actually writing the proposals together, putting them together and actually getting them reviewed by people who'd actually seen OLT grants before. This was the first time I'd ever written an OLT grant, so it was really, really useful to get expert feedback from people who had seen lots of OLT grants and actually been involved in successful ones as well. So the resources that the Monash Academy gave us were great. Even in terms of just seeing previously successful bids was a great, great help. The other thing which really helped putting this bid the bids together that we put in was that I had experience of doing similar types of work with other government agencies, particularly in the UK. So I was quite used to writing proposals that weren't necessarily pure research. They were perhaps more evaluation focused. So in terms of the language that you use, the way you set the proposals up, the way that you actually kind of pitch yourself, that was a very kind of useful experience that we could draw upon. You're not trying to put together a pure research project that's just going to kind of address very niche research problems. You are aware of the kind of the bigger usefulness of these research grants. So that experience plus the Monash Academy help, I think, helped swing it for us. Knowing what we know now about working with the OLT, I think there's two things which I would kind of advise myself if I could go back in time. First of all is that it's definitely worth going for. I was a little bit tentative about working with the OLT before because I wasn't entirely sure if they had particular agendas or they'd be particularly difficult to work with. In the event, they were great. They were a really great funding agency to work with. They were very amenable to working with us. They were easy to communicate with. We had no problems there at all. And knowing what I know now about in terms of putting in the proposals, interestingly, we put in 3 proposals at the time. We got 2 successfully funded and we got 1 that wasn't funded. And looking back, it's very obvious why the one that wasn't funded. Although we were taking the same approach and it was the same research team, we were making exaggerated claims for what wasn't known. We were making exaggerated claims for what we could do, and we were kind of overselling ourselves. And I think in many ways, OLT are looking for research which is going to be kind of honest and make a real difference rather than try to kind of solve all the world's problems. So we kind of overpitched ourselves. So I think be realistic and actually be kind of honest about what it is you're going to do, and you'll stand a much better chance. The outcomes of any research project are really, really important. And one of the things that we were very mindful of was not just to say that we would disseminate, but we would actually look to how we could make impact. And particularly make impact across the HE sector and with other groups in and around HE. So we had to get out of the dissemination mindset and think much more about outcomes and impact throughout the duration of the projects. In the Strategic Commission project that we put together, we actually embedded that into the methodology. So we had 3 particular stages of our project, and they were iterative. So the first 2 stages then led to a final stage where we actually fed forward our findings throughout the 39 institutions, throughout the 39 universities in Australia, presenting what we'd found, which was based around these 2 questions of what works and why. We then fed them forward to the different institutions to get institutional feedback about the constraints and the issues that, from an institutional and managerial point of view, would constrain our findings. Now that had an advantage in 2 different ways. First of all, it made the findings, the eventual findings of the project, much, much more plausible and much, much more useful. But it also had the advantage of making sure that every university in Australia had engaged with our research findings and our evaluation findings during the project. So it meant that we could actually claim that we had managed to kind of reach out to across the sector. So in terms of making sure of the project having a usefulness beyond the lifetime of the project, we're now finding that that's having the effect that those institutions are now coming back to us with more specific questions in terms of what did you find in terms of this particular technology in this particular subject area. So I think it worked really, really well, and it's certainly a model which I would use in other research projects and other evaluation projects. So being mindful of making an impact throughout the project, not just after the project, was key. The reference group element of the project was really, really interesting. In one respect, it was something which we had to do. Looking back, it was something that I'm really glad that we did do. So we were very careful from the get-go to make sure that we had a small group of people that we could call upon, not make too much kind of demands upon, because obviously they're not getting paid, but we made sure that we had a few representatives from Australian higher education institutions. We had a couple of representatives from international, from overseas, that could give us a slightly kind of different perspective. And we also had a couple of representatives from outside of the university sector, specifically from industry. And we used them in 3 different phases. So at the very, very beginning of the project, we used the reference group to actually attune us to wider conversations or policy priorities or areas of debate that our research and our evaluation tapped into. And these were agendas that we needed to be aware of in terms of making sure that we were doing research and evaluation that would make a difference. We then used the reference group as a sounding board. Because our research was iterative, at the end of the first stage, we wanted to make sure that we weren't going off in wildly wrong directions. And we got some really interesting kind of feedback from the reference group there in terms of where we could be going into our second phase. Then at the very end, we used the reference group for help with where this research would go, where it should be going, where our messages and our findings would fly, where we should be thinking of actually disseminating. So they were very, very useful in terms of making sure that we got off on the right foot, we were heading in the right direction, and then we ended up making a difference at the end.